Something happens sometimes in the middle of laughter that most people never notice. You're sitting with people, friends or colleagues or family maybe, and everyone is talking and the conversation is flowing, and someone says something funny, and everyone laughs. You laugh too. You say the right things and nod at the right moments, and from the outside you look like you belong there with everyone else. Inside though, there's this feeling, this quiet and persistent feeling, that you're watching all of this from somewhere else. Like you're standing on the other side of glass, with your hand pressed against it, mimicking the warmth you can see but can't quite feel. The strangest part is that no one else seems to notice the glass is even there, and you wonder if you're the only one who can feel it separating you from everything. This is what it feels like to be a chronic outsider, not someone who occasionally feels lonely, or someone going through a phase of social disconnection, but someone for whom outsiderness feels like a baseline state of being. A gravitational pull that exists no matter how welcomed you are, no matter how much you're included, no matter how hard you try to belong to the group around you. People who genuinely care about you could surround you, and you'd still feel fundamentally separate from them. You could be invited to everything, and still arrive with the quiet certainty that you don't quite fit into the space that they've made. It's not that you're excluded, it's that some invisible membrane exists between you and the world, and you've never figured out how to dissolve it or push through to the other side. What makes it so confusing is that you can't always point to a reason for feeling this way. You're not necessarily shy. You might even be articulate and funny, and capable of deep conversation when the moment calls for it. You're not cruel or off-putting to the people around you. You haven't been ostracized in any obvious way. Sometimes people seem to like you. They smile when you walk into a room and ask you questions and want to hear what you have to say, but there's this feeling, persistent and shadow-like, that you're performing belonging rather than living it. That everyone else received some instruction manual for human connection that you somehow missed when it was being handed out. When you're alone, you feel the ache of separation pulling at you. When you're with others, though, you often feel more alone than ever, because the disconnection becomes visible in a way it never is when you're by yourself. It's not that you don't want connection, it's that connection feels like a language you understand intellectually, but can't quite speak fluently. Like trying to sing along to a song when you only know every third word, and have to hum the rest. Most people experience loneliness as something that happens to them, a circumstance or a temporary state, something that shifts when situations change or new people come into their lives. For the chronic outsider, though, it's something closer to identity, a way of moving through the world that stays consistent no matter where you go, a lens through which every interaction is filtered and interpreted and understood. The cruelest part is that you become aware that the problem might not be external, that maybe there's something in the way you're wired, something in your history or your psychology, that keeps recreating this distance between you and everyone else. So the outsiderness becomes layered with shame, not just the thought that you don't belong, but the deeper fear that there's something wrong with you that prevents you from belonging. This script isn't about fixing that feeling though. It's not about 10 steps to finally fit in, or reframing your loneliness into something productive, or learning social skills that will dissolve the glass between you and the world. The truth is that for some people, outsiderness isn't a problem to be solved, but a psychological reality to be understood. Understanding it, really understanding where it comes from and what it means, changes everything about how you hold it. Not because understanding makes it go away or transforms you into someone who belongs easily. Understanding removes the layer of shame though, because it reveals that this feeling, as painful as it is, comes from somewhere specific. It has roots that go deep, it has reasons that make sense, and it has buried within it a kind of devastating clarity that most people never develop because they've never had to stand outside and watch. The question isn't how do I stop feeling like an outsider, because that question assumes the feeling is simply wrong and needs to be eliminated. The question is, what does it mean that I've always felt this way? What has this position shown me that I wouldn't have seen otherwise? What has it cost me in terms of connection and ease? And what has it given me that I didn't ask for but can't give back now that it's part of who I am? Chronic outsiders see things other people don't notice because they're too immersed in the moment to step back. They notice the small fractures in social performances. They feel the emotional undercurrents that everyone else is too busy participating in to detect. They live with a kind of double consciousness, simultaneously in the moment and outside of it, that creates both profound loneliness and profound perception at the same time. You are not broken because you feel this way. You're shaped by forces that were largely out of your control. Some of those forces were developmental, some were temperamental, some were cultural, and some remain entirely mysterious even when you look back and try to trace them. That position, painful as it is, if you feel like a permanent outsider, it almost certainly started long before you were conscious of the feeling taking root. Outsiderness doesn't usually begin with a single rejection or a dramatic social failure that you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. It begins quietly in childhood, in the thousands of tiny interactions that teach you how to understand yourself in relation to others around you. It begins in the way you were seen or not seen by the people who raised you, in the way your needs were met or left unmet when you reached out for connection, in the way you learned very early that something about you didn't quite match the world you were born into, and that mismatch created a distance you've been trying to close ever since. Some people are born with a different operating system running beneath their consciousness. Not broken and not worse, just different, in ways that matter when you're trying to connect with others. They might be highly sensitive, feeling everything more intensely than the people around them, picking up on emotional frequencies that others don't register or respond to. They might be introverted in a culture that rewards extroversion and constant social engagement, needing solitude in environments that interpret solitude as rejection or withdrawal. They might be neurodivergent, autistic, or ADHD, existing with a neurological architecture that doesn't align with social norms that were never designed for minds like theirs. When you're wired differently from the majority, the world doesn't feel like it was built for you, because it wasn't. Every social interaction requires a little more effort and a little more translation. You're constantly doing this invisible labour of interpreting and adjusting and code switching, while everyone else seems to move through social space effortlessly and instinctively without thinking about it. Children notice this difference even if they can't articulate what they're noticing. They notice that connection comes harder for them than it does for the kids around them, that they're often alone at recess, or that they say the wrong thing at the wrong time, or that other kids seem to share some unspoken understanding that they're excluded from. From that noticing, a story begins to form in their young minds. I am different, and different means less than. Different means outside. Different means alone. Temperament is only part of it, though, because sometimes outsiderness is forged through early relationships, specifically through attachment patterns that form before memory begins. If your earliest relationships were inconsistent or unpredictable or emotionally unavailable, you learned that people are unsafe and closeness leads to disappointment. You learned that it's better to expect nothing than to be let down again. So you developed what psychologists call an avoidant attachment style. You learned to protect yourself by not fully letting people in. You learned to be self-sufficient to the point where needing anyone felt like weakness. That self-sufficiency, while protective in the moment, also creates distance that persists into adulthood. It keeps you orbiting around connection without ever fully landing in it. Or maybe your early relationships were enmeshed and overwhelming and intrusive, so you learned that closeness means losing yourself in someone else's needs, that to be loved is to be consumed and controlled. So you instinctively pull back now, creating space and maintaining boundaries that keep you separate. Not because you don't want connection, but because connection has always felt dangerous to the part of you that remembers what it cost before. Then there are the children who are simply different in ways that their families or communities couldn't accept or understand. The child who was too emotional in a family that valued stoicism and self-control. The child who was intellectual in a family that was physical and practical. The child who was queer in a heteronormative environment where deviation wasn't tolerated. The child who was creative in a pragmatic household that saw art as frivolous. The child whose racial or cultural identity didn't match the dominant culture around them. The immigrant child. The third culture kid. The one who belonged to multiple worlds but felt fully at home in none of them. These children learn early that their authentic self is not welcome in the spaces they occupy. That, to be seen, they must edit themselves down into something more acceptable. Editing becomes exhausting, though. And eventually something inside them makes a decision. If I have to hide who I am to belong, then I'd rather not belong at all. So they choose integrity over acceptance. They choose authenticity over inclusion. And they become outsiders not by exclusion, but by self-protection. Sometimes outsiderness is born from trauma that rewired how safety feels in the body, from bullying that taught you that groups are dangerous and trust is foolish, from early losses that made the world feel fundamentally unsafe and unpredictable, from betrayals that taught you that the people who say they care are often the ones who hurt you most, from experiences that fractured your sense that you belong in the world at all. When trauma happens early enough, it doesn't just create memories you can process and move past. It creates a nervous system that's always scanning for threats, always braced for rejection, always prepared to be hurt before the hurt can land. That hypervigilance makes genuine connection nearly impossible, because you can't relax into intimacy when your body is perpetually expecting danger around every corner. What all of these origins have in common is this lesson they teach. They teach you, in some deep and pre-verbal way, that you are separate from the world around you, that the world is them and you are you, and the two exist in different categories that don't quite overlap. Once that separation is established in your young mind, once that template is formed, it becomes the lens through which you interpret everything that happens after. You begin to collect evidence that confirms it. When someone doesn't text back, it's because you're forgettable. When a conversation goes quiet, it's because you said the wrong thing. When a group forms and you're not included, it's because you don't belong there. You're not making these interpretations consciously. Your brain is simply running the program it was given years ago. The most painful part is that even when circumstances change dramatically, the feeling often doesn't budge. You can move to a new place and find new people and enter environments where you're genuinely welcomed and wanted, and still the outsiderness remains, like a shadow you can't shake. It's no longer about external circumstances at that point. It's internal now. It's become part of your identity and your narrative and your understanding of who you are in the world. You are the person who doesn't quite belong, not because anyone is actively excluding you anymore, but because outsiderness has become the shape of your psychological life. It's the water you swim in and the air you breathe, the baseline against which all experiences are measured and understood. What makes it so difficult to change is that part of you doesn't want to change it. Because as painful as outsiderness is, it's also familiar in a way that brings strange comfort. It's predictable, and it's safe in the way that known pain is always safer than unknown vulnerability. If you expect to be on the outside, you're never surprised by rejection when it comes. If you maintain distance from others, you're never devastated by abandonment. Outsiderness becomes a kind of armor, uncomfortable and isolating, but protective against the deeper wounds you fear most. So you carry it forward from childhood into adolescence into adulthood. This feeling that you are fundamentally separate from the world around you. Not because you're broken or defective, but because somewhere long ago, in ways you may not even remember clearly, you learned that this is who you are and this is how you survive. Until you understand that, until you see the origins clearly without judgment, you'll keep interpreting outsiderness as evidence of your inadequacy, rather than as a psychological inheritance you never asked for, but received anyway. Chronic outsiders develop a particular quality of consciousness that's hard to describe if you haven't experienced it yourself. If you have experienced it, though, you'll recognize it immediately. It's the feeling of watching your own life from a slight distance, of being simultaneously inside your body and observing yourself from the outside at the same time, of never being fully and unself-consciously immersed in a moment because part of you is always monitoring, analyzing, evaluating how you're being perceived by everyone around you. Psychologists sometimes call this self-consciousness, but that term doesn't capture the depth of what's actually happening in your mind. It's not just awareness of yourself as an object in space, it's a split in consciousness itself. You're having the experience and watching yourself have the experience at the exact same time. You're in the conversation and outside the conversation, noting your own performance, critiquing your own responses, wondering if you're saying the right thing, if your face is doing the right thing, if you're managing to approximate the ease that everyone else seems to possess naturally without effort. This double consciousness is exhausting. in ways that are hard to explain to people who don't experience it. You're never just present in the moment, you're never just laughing without also hearing your own laugh and wondering if it sounds forced or fake. You're never just talking without also listening to yourself talk and cringing at the words coming out of your mouth. You're never just existing without also evaluating your existence. Measuring it against some invisible standard you can never quite meet no matter how hard you try. Other people seem to move through social situations on autopilot. They respond naturally and instinctively, without thinking about every micro-expression. You're flying manual though, checking every instrument, adjusting every control, trying desperately not to crash and burn in front of everyone. The effort of it, the constant self-monitoring and adjustment creates exactly the awkwardness you're trying to avoid in the first place. But here's the strange paradox that nobody talks about. This same hypervigilance also makes you remarkably perceptive in ways others aren't. Because you're always watching, you see things other people miss completely. You notice the micro-expressions that flash across faces, the shifts in tone that signal discomfort, the moments when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes. You pick up on the emotional undercurrents in a room, the tension between two people, the person who's pretending to be fine but isn't, the way someone's enthusiasm is performative rather than genuine. You have an almost supernatural ability to read subtext, to sense what's not being said, to feel the emotional weather that everyone else is too immersed to notice. This is both a gift and a curse wrapped into one ability. A gift because it makes you deeply empathetic and emotionally intelligent, capable of profound understanding when someone opens up to you. A curse because you're aware of every small rejection, every subtle exclusion, every moment when someone's attention shifts away from you towards something more interesting. You're collecting data constantly from your environment, and most of that data confirms your deepest fear that you don't quite belong here with these people. Your brain, trying to protect you from future pain, starts to expect rejection before it even happens. It starts looking for rejection and hunting for it, and finding it even in neutral interactions that don't actually contain it. Someone doesn't respond to your text immediately, and your brain supplies the story without evidence. They're avoiding you. Someone seems distracted during a conversation, and your brain interprets it as disinterest in what you're saying. Someone laughs at someone else's joke louder than they laughed at yours, and your brain files it as evidence of your inadequacy compared to others. This is called confirmation bias. And outsiders are masters of it without realizing what they're doing. You've spent so long feeling separate that your brain has developed an entire cognitive apparatus designed to confirm that separation. It filters reality through the lens of outsiderness, discarding evidence that contradicts the narrative and amplifying evidence that supports it. The cruelest part is that this becomes self-fulfilling over time, because when you expect rejection, you subtly create the conditions for it to occur. You hold back and don't fully engage. You keep one foot out the door, ready to leave before you're asked to leave. People feel that distance in you. They interpret it as disinterest, or coldness, or unavailability, and they respond by pulling back themselves in response. So the outsiderness perpetuates itself in an endless loop. Not because people don't want to connect with you, but because the walls you've built to protect yourself from rejection also prevent genuine connection from forming. You've become so good at not needing people that people stop trying to reach you. And then your brain says, "See, I told you this would happen, you don't belong here with them." Beneath all of this is a particular kind of shame that's hard to name or acknowledge. Not the shame of having done something wrong, but the shame of being something wrong in your fundamental nature, of feeling fundamentally defective as a human being, of believing that everyone else receives some essential piece of humanity that you're missing through some cosmic accident. Other people seem to connect effortlessly, form friendships easily, navigate social situations without this constant internal monologue of doubt and analysis and second-guessing. You're left wondering what's wrong with me. Why is this so hard for me when it seems so easy for everyone else? Why do I feel like I'm playing a game where everyone else knows the rules except me? This is imposter syndrome at its deepest level, not just feeling like a fraud professionally, but feeling like a fraud as a human being. Like you're pretending to be a person, mimicking human behavior from the outside, but everyone can see through the performance if they look closely enough. Like at any moment, someone will point at you and say, "What are you doing here? You're not one of us. You don't belong in this space." So you develop strategies to cope with this feeling, to protect yourself from the pain of it. Maybe you intellectualize everything, turning your outsiderness into a philosophical stance, a kind of enlightened detachment from the shallow social games everyone else plays. You tell yourself that you're above the performance of normalcy, that you see through it all, that your solitude is chosen rather than imposed on you by circumstance. This protects your ego from damage, but it also deepens your isolation, because it turns connection into something beneath you, rather than something you're afraid you can't have. Or maybe you become cynical about the whole thing, mocking the very connection you crave deep down. You make jokes about how fake people are, how superficial social rituals are, how much you prefer solitude to the exhausting performance of socializing. You perform contempt for the belonging you secretly long for with every fibre of your being. This too is protective. If you reject connection first, then it can't reject you and leave you wounded. Or maybe you simply withdraw from the whole game. You stop trying to belong anywhere. You accept outsiderness as your fate and build a life around it, cultivating solitude, developing independence, becoming self-sufficient to the point where needing people feels like weakness you can't afford. There's something noble in this approach, something dignified about accepting who you are. But there's also something heartbreaking beneath the acceptance, because beneath it is often a deep and quiet grief for the connection you've convinced yourself you don't need anymore. The outsider mind is a complex thing that contains contradictions within itself. It's hypervigilant and perceptive at the same time. It's protective and self-sabotaging. It sees clearly and distorts reality. It craves connection and fears it in equal measure. It's the mind of someone who has learned to survive outside the circle, but who has never quite stopped pressing their hand against the glass, hoping someone will notice and let them in. There's something no one tells you about being an outsider, something that gets lost in all the talk about loneliness and disconnection, and the ache of not belonging anywhere, something that feels almost forbidden to acknowledge, because it might sound like you're romanticizing your own pain or suggesting that suffering is noble. But it's true nonetheless. Outsiderness gives you things that belonging never could, not in a way that makes the pain worth it, or suggests you should be grateful for your suffering, but in the simple and honest recognition that the position you've occupied has shaped you in ways that are genuinely valuable. The first thing it gives you is empathy, not the performative kind that comes from being told you should care about others. The deep and structural empathy that comes from knowing what it feels like to be unseen, to be on the margins, to be the one whose pain goes unnoticed because you've learnt to hide it so well that no one can detect it. When you've lived on the outside, you develop an instinct for other people's outsiderness that others don't have. You can spot it across a room before anyone else notices. The person who's smiling but not present, the one who's laughing but looks tired behind their eyes, the one who's there but somehow not there, in any meaningful way. You recognize the performance of belonging because you've performed it yourself 1,000 times. That recognition creates a particular kind of tenderness toward others, a particular willingness to see people in their hidden struggle, to meet them in their loneliness without needing them to explain it or justify it. This is a form of emotional intelligence that can't be taught in any classroom. It can only be lived through direct experience. It makes you capable of a depth of connection that people who've never felt outside themselves often can't access, because you know that the deepest part of a person is usually the part they're most afraid to show anyone. You're willing to meet them there, in that hidden place, not because you're trying to be compassionate, but because that's where you live yourself. The second gift is perception that cuts through the surface of things. Because you've spent so much time watching from the outside, you've developed an almost anthropological awareness of how people work beneath their presentations. Temperament. You see the patterns and the performances, the unspoken rules that govern social interaction in ways most people never consciously recognize. You notice what people are really saying beneath what they're saying out loud. You pick up on contradictions and inconsistencies, the moments when someone's words don't match their energy or their body language. This makes you a devastating reader of human behavior when you pay attention. You understand motivation in ways that people who are immersed in social life often don't, because immersion prevents the distance necessary for clear seeing. You see the insecurity behind the arrogance, the loneliness behind the constant socializing, the fear behind the aggression that people weaponize. This understanding gives you a kind of freedom from manipulation, because when you can see the mechanisms, you're less controlled by them. You're less likely to take things personally, less likely to mistake performance for reality, less likely to be manipulated by people who are skilled at social presentation, but hollow underneath. This perception extends to culture itself in ways that matter. Outsiders are often the ones who see what's dysfunctional in the systems everyone else takes for granted without question, who question norms that everyone else accepts as natural and inevitable, who notice the ways that normal is often just a consensus built on unexamined assumptions that benefit some at the expense of others. You're less susceptible to groupthink because you're not fully in the group, less likely to absorb beliefs uncritically because you've always had enough distance to think for yourself without the pressure to conform. This is why so many artists and writers and philosophers and innovators have been outsiders throughout history, not because suffering makes you creative in some magical way, but because the position of outsiderness, the ability to see your own culture with some degree of objectivity, creates the conditions for original thought, for questioning what everyone else assumes, for imagining alternatives that don't exist yet. You're not bound by the same social pressures to conform and fit in, so you have more freedom to think independently, to create something genuinely new rather than simply replicating what already exists in slightly modified form. The third gift is authenticity that comes from having no other choice. Because you've never quite fit in anywhere, you've had less incentive to perform normalcy or mold yourself into acceptable shapes. You've been forced in a way to develop a relationship with who you actually are rather than who you're supposed to be. While this is painful because it means living without the validation that comes from fitting in easily, it also means you've built something real inside yourself, something solid that doesn't depend on other people's approval to exist or sustain itself. People who've always belonged often don't know who they are outside of their social context or their role in the group. Their identity is so intertwined with their group membership, their social role, their ability to fit in, that they've never had to develop a self that exists independently of external validation. You have, though, you've had to build that because belonging was never an option available to you. Because belonging was never guaranteed, you learnt to belong to yourself first, and that creates a particular kind of integrity that can't be faked or performed. When you do connect with people, it's genuine rather than strategic, not performative and not designed to maintain your position in a social hierarchy. You're not trying to be liked or trying to fit in or trying to secure your place. You're simply being who you are. And if people connect with that, then the connection is real, deep and substantial, based on actual recognition rather than mutual performance of acceptable personas, and the relationships you form might be fewer in number than what other people accumulate effortlessly, but they're often richer and more honest and more substantial than the dozens of surface-level friendships that people who belong easily accumulate without effort or intention. None of this makes the pain of outsiderness go away, though. It doesn't erase the loneliness or make the longing for belonging disappear into nothing. It doesn't mean you should be grateful for your suffering, or that your isolation was somehow necessary for your development. But it does mean that you are not only what you've lost in this life, you are also what you've gained through the position you've occupied. And what you've gained, the empathy and the perception and the authenticity, is not nothing or compensation. It's real and it's yours. And it came from exactly the place you've been standing all along. The question eventually becomes, now what? Where do you go from here with this understanding? Not how do I stop being an outsider? Because by now you understand that outsiderness isn't simply a problem to be solved with the right technique. It's woven into your psychology and your history and your way of seeing the world around you. It's not going anywhere completely, no matter what you do. But the question remains, how do you live with this? How do you find connection without betraying the self you've worked so hard to build in isolation? How do you let people in without losing the integrity that outsiderness has forced you to develop over years? The answer is not about fixing yourself into a more acceptable shape. It's about understanding that there's a difference between healing and conforming, between opening yourself to connection and contorting yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. Between building bridges and dismantling your boundaries completely. The work is not to become someone who belongs easily, someone you've never been and likely never will be. The work is to find ways to connect that honor who you actually are beneath all the performance. This starts with changing your relationship to the feeling itself, to the outsiderness that's been your companion for so long. For so long, you've probably treated your outsiderness as evidence of deficiency, as something shameful, something to hide, something that means there's something wrong with you at your core. But what if it's not that at all? What if it's simply a fact of your psychological architecture? One that comes with costs, but also with capacities you wouldn't have developed otherwise. What if the goal is not to eliminate the feeling, but to stop letting it convince you that you're broken beyond repair? This is where self-compassion becomes not a nice idea, but something necessary for survival. Not in the self-help sense of positive affirmations or loving yourself unconditionally, no matter what, but in the quieter sense of recognizing that you are doing something difficult every single day. That moving through the world with this particular sensitivity, this particular awareness, this particular distance requires enormous effort that most people never have to expend. That you've been working harder at human connection than most people ever have to, and that deserves acknowledgement rather than judgment or shame. You are not failing at something that's easy for everyone else around you. You are succeeding at something that's genuinely hard. And when you can meet yourself with that kind of understanding, when you can see your struggle as struggle rather than as inadequacy or personal failure, something shifts inside. The shame loosens its grip on you. The self-criticism quiets down to a whisper. And in that quieter space, connection becomes a little more possible. Because you're no longer approaching it from a place of desperate need to prove you're okay. You're approaching it from a place of knowing deeply that you already are okay, that you've always been okay even in your not belonging. The second piece is learning to practice what might be called selective vulnerability with the right people. You don't need to open yourself to everyone who crosses your path. You don't need to force connection in spaces where it doesn't fit naturally. You don't need to perform closeness with people who don't actually see you beneath the surface. But you can learn to recognize the rare moments when someone seems to operate on your frequency, when a conversation goes deeper than small talk, when someone asks a real question and waits for a real answer, when you feel that strange and tentative possibility that maybe this person could understand what you usually keep hidden. In those moments, you can practice staying present instead of running away, not performing connection or rushing to fill silence with words that mean nothing, not immediately retreating into the safety of distance when things get vulnerable, but staying there in the discomfort, even when it feels vulnerable, even when your instinct is to pull back and protect yourself, even when every part of you wants to leave before you're left standing alone. This is terrifying because it means risking the exact rejection you've spent your life trying to avoid at all costs. But it's also the only way connection ever happens between two people. Not through forcing yourself into spaces where you don't belong, but through allowing yourself to be seen in the rare spaces where someone is actually looking for you beneath the surface presentation. And here's what you'll discover when you take that risk. Your people exist out there in the world, not in the way that mainstream belonging exists for others, not in large groups, not in effortless social ease, not in the constant hum of surface-level friendship, but in the quiet recognition between people who understand what it means to live slightly outside the world, other outsiders, other observers, other people who've learnt to think independently and feel deeply and exist authentically because belonging was never an option available to them. These connections might be rare and hard to find, but they're real when you find them, and they're worth the loneliness in between. The third piece is accepting that some degree of outsiderness might simply be part of who you are and always will be. Not because you're broken or because you haven't healed enough or tried hard enough, but because the psychological structure that creates outsiderness, the sensitivity and the perceptiveness and the reflective distance is also the structure that makes you who you are underneath everything. And you might not want to give that up even if you could, even if someone offered you a magic pill that would make you belong easily everywhere you go. There's a version of healing that's really just conformity in disguise, dressed up in therapeutic language. That measures success by how well you can finally fit into spaces that were never designed for you in the first place. That treats your difference as pathology and your independence as defense mechanism. And that version of healing asks you to become less yourself, to sand down your edges, in order to belong more easily in spaces that don't actually want who you really are. But there's another version of healing that says you can be both. You can acknowledge the pain of outsiderness without trying to eliminate the parts of yourself that create it. You can seek connection without abandoning the solitude that shaped you into who you are. You can build relationships without losing the integrity that comes from having lived outside the circle. You can belong to yourself first, and from that place, from that deep and solid sense of internal belonging, connection becomes something you choose rather than something you desperately need to survive. It becomes an addition to your life rather than the condition for your life being okay at all. And paradoxically, that's when connection often becomes more possible with others, because you're no longer approaching people from a place of lack or desperation. You're approaching them from a place of wholeness, and people can feel the difference in how you show up. This doesn't mean the longing goes away completely, or that you stop wishing belonging came more easily to you. It doesn't mean you never feel that familiar ache of separation anymore, that old pain of pressing your hand against glass that nobody else can see. But it means you understand it differently now. You understand that it's not evidence of your inadequacy or proof that something is wrong with you. It's evidence of your particular way of being in the world, a way that's difficult and lonely but also perceptive and authentic and deep in ways that most people never access. And maybe that's enough for now, not because it has to be, or because you should settle for loneliness, not because you should convince yourself you don't need connection at all, but because you are already whole even in your incompleteness. Already enough even in your longing, already complete even while you're still searching for your people in a world that wasn't built for outsiders like you. The glass might always be there between you and the world, that invisible membrane you've felt since childhood. But you're not defective for feeling it, and you're not failing for noticing it when others don't. You're simply living with a particular kind of awareness, a particular kind of consciousness that most people never have to develop because they've never had to stand outside and watch themselves from a distance. That awareness, as painful as it is to carry, has made you who you are underneath everything else. Someone who sees clearly when others are blind, who feels deeply when others stay on the surface, who thinks independently when others follow the crowd, who exists authentically even when authenticity means standing alone in a room full of people. And maybe in the end that's not exile from the human community after all. Maybe it's just a different way of being home in yourself, a different way of belonging that doesn't depend on fitting into spaces that were never designed for the shape you are. Maybe it's its own kind of arrival,